So it's been like years, but I am back. There's just a lot going on in my brain right now. And I just need to talk about it. Unless you've been living under a rock, the murder of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have sparked a significant amount of discourse and honestly overdue attention on the focus of the state of racism in America and the injustices towards Black Americans. But because of that, social media has been really awful to be a part of. Not because of people like raising awareness or talking about what you can do to support these movements, but the people choosing to be defensive and problematic when so much information exists in the world. And seeing this, especially in the Asian American community, is really unbearable. I'm obviously not Black, and I don't want to take away from the Black Lives Matter movement at all, but I think more than ever, as a minority, our minority group should stick together. I want to put some information out there to dispel some confusion and just an anti-Blackness dialogue that's been occurring and hopefully unify more Asian Americans in support of the Black community. Are there any points of contention or issues or things that you're kind of confused upon or disagree with me on? I think utilizing the comment section as a way to have healthy conversations is really important instead of just shutting people down. So I would love to see that. As an East Asian, we kind of benefit from white adjacent privilege, and because this is the case, we, I think, have a responsibility to acknowledge that and use that privilege to speak on behalf of the Black community and really show up for them. And that means confronting anti-Blackness in our own community, understanding our own biases and ways we might perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and ending our silence and complacency on issues like police brutality, mass incarceration, gentrification, and so many more. So starting off with the Yellow Peril supports Black Power, I've been seeing a ton of these pieces of art on Instagram, and I love them. I just want to make sure that people understand what it means when they repost a piece of art like this that has this message, because it's a really important part of Asian American history. This is my favorite one. This artist is incredible. I love her work. I love this image and her design and the whole message that is being shared, and she does not give enough credit for it. This image was inspired by this one, which I want to break it down a little bit further because it serves as the inspiration point behind all the Yellow Peril supports Black Power pieces of art. In this one, this sign and this photo was taken at a rally in 1969 in Oakland supporting Huey Newton, who was a PhD in sociology, an activist, a revolutionary, and of course the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. The term Yellow Peril began in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, when politicians would call Asian Americans that to make them seem like a danger to white Americans. So, of course, this was a really derogatory term, but by adopting this label, and as you've seen in the protest signs, we have essentially rendered it powerless and reclaimed it and reappropriated it, turning it into a phrase of empowerment and something that we could rally behind. So when you see pieces of art like this, there's a lot of history behind them and why we use specifically the language Yellow Peril. It's a callback to those specific protests. But what does Yellow Peril have to do with Black Power? Especially in that period of time, there was a sentiment among minority groups that what affected one minority group affected every single minority group. Because the fact of the matter is that we were all the same. We were non-white. Every minority group has struggled against the same evil, and that is the white majority's refusal to accept the reality of incredibly nuanced and diverse groups. Obviously, the means of everyone's struggles has been very, very different, but knowing this, it's not hard to understand why Yellow Peril, one minority group, supports Black Power, another minority group. And all that brings me to the intertwined nature of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and how that influenced the Asian American movement. So, like you probably know from history class,
the civil rights movement was characterized by high-level activism of African Americans during the 50s and 60s. The struggle for racial equality took on a message of tolerance and nonviolence among its participants and shaped the minds of many Asian Americans.
The Black Power movement really continued that legacy. Countless of studies from the Asian American movement attributed the Black Power movement as one of the motivating factors for Asian American activism. I'll also attach an article that has listed specific accounts of the influence of the Black Power movement and how they specifically impact certain Asian American activists. Besides offering tactical lessons, the civil rights and the Black Power movement had a really profound impact on the consciousness of Asian Americans and really sensitized them to racial issues. There is a natural relation to people of color and African Americans because there were similar racial concerns. This racial perspective really bound them to Asian groups as well as other minorities. Blacks fought for all people of color in their struggle for civil rights, but they really ignited the spark of racial justice for Asian Americans. Two individuals directly influenced by ties to the Black community include Richard Aoki. There's been information that came out that said that he could be an FBI informant. Still kind of uncertain right now, but basically he was a Japanese American who joined as one of the very early members of the Black Panther Party with Huey Newton. And then later, after he transferred schools, he became a member of the AAPA. And he's also featured along with the many Yellow Peril supports Black Power images protesting for Huey Newton. He was a really key influential activist. Yuri Kochiyama was another key activist and figure in the Asian American movement as well. Also, badass lady. She was directly impacted by Malcolm X. Because she lived in Harlem, she was able to become friends with him and was even at his side when he was assassinated. I also want to talk about three really progressive movements during that time as well that also attributed a lot and were inspired a lot by the Black Power movement. So the first one is the Third World Liberation Front, which if you guys watch the PBS docuseries Asian Americans, you know something about. Basically, they were a group that was really focused on getting an ethnic college to highlight the studies of third world people at colleges like UC Berkeley and San Diego State University. And not only did they mobilize Asian American students, but they mobilized a wide range of minorities. So another was the Red Guard Party, which was a really radical left-wing political party, and they based themselves very closely off of the Black Panther Party. We should identify ourselves with all oppressed people who are struggling for liberation. And this was stated by Alex Hing, one of the key founders of the specific movement. The third group that I want to talk about is Asian American Political Alliance. And in the 60s, they coined the term Asian American. This self-definition really symbolized empowerment and signaled a new way of thinking, as opposed to the colonizer term Oriental, which is what was used before. So they were able to develop close ties with the Black Panther Party as well as the Red Guard. A specific quote from this organization was that we must begin to build our own society alongside our Black, Brown, and Red brothers, which is something that I think is a really common theme throughout many of these organizations at the time. They really urge their members to participate in organizations with other third world people to fight for their common goals and help transform their society for the better. Alleviating our own concerns and their own concerns was not enough. They had to solve the problem of all people of color. And this is a mindset that we've kind of lost throughout time. I do want to highlight that though there was a lot of mutual understanding and collaboration that existed during those times in the civil rights movement, there was still some level of conflict, and throughout our history, we obviously have had a complicated relationship with the Black community, and just understanding the situations with Peter Liang or the LA race riots, or even understanding the role that we play in affirmative action and those specific cases, I think are really important to understand and continue to support the Black community and understand the emotions from both sides. But regardless, by the early 60s, there was a really strong push to reform the U.S. immigration policy because of the Civil Rights Movement. The Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, is what really abolished the quota system that was previously used and created a new basis for immigration policy. And that's what many of us, myself included, with immigrant parents, have really benefited from. The 1965 Act is undoubtedly a result of the civil rights movement and the general effort to eliminate race discrimination from U.S. law. With the model minority concept, we have white adjacent privilege, and in some studies we've honestly also been considered honorary whites. The model minority concept is that Asian immigrants started out in their country persecuted and considered pariahs, but despite all of that, they are now the new American achievers. The important thing to note is that the underlying message is that because we have succeeded despite systematic discrimination means that other minority groups like Blacks shouldn't be entitled to government aid to be able to achieve a similar level of success, and that no amount of externally imposed hardship can keep a good minority down. But something that we really need to note is that although Asian Americans experience extreme hardship or were excluded, it was all of the trials and tribulations are nowhere near the extent of African Americans. So the media perpetuated the idea that all minorities should have the same success we do as a way to delegitimize the claims of racism, especially from Blacks, which put us in a really vulnerable position to be used by whiteness. And this is actually something that we've seen time and time again in the Third World Liberation strikes. The SFSC College actually appointed S.I. Hayakawa, who was an Asian president, and to use him against the minorities. And it's something that we've seen especially in affirmative action cases as well, if you guys remember the Harvard case that recently occurred. We've often been pitted against one another to deflect a fuller examination of the systemic racism that exists and white supremacy. And I see that happening right now where people are like, oh, I don't see Black people standing up for me during COVID, or something, and vice versa during these racially charged events. That's a really problematic way to approach thinking. Like, if you don't do something for me, why would I stick up for you? It's a vicious cycle that will only perpetuate itself. Like I mentioned, Asian Americans were dubbed the model minority. And to delve upon the relationship further between Asian Americans who are the good minority and Blacks who are the deficient minorities, this all kind of encompasses under racial triangulation. And so racial triangulation materializes through processes which ultimately serve to reinforce the white power and privilege that exists. So the mainstream media favors Asians over blacks because we're the model minority, we work hard and we have successes, while claiming that blacks are more deficient. But unlike blacks, Asians will continue to be alien and unable to fully assimilate into mainstream culture, and are never going to be perceived as true Americans. So I don't really want to get too in the weeds, but I want to break down how racial triangulation occurs, as described by Claire Kim, who founded this concept. And it occurs through relative valorization and civic ostracism. Relative valorization is characterized of when a dominant group, like the whites, assign value to and construct the identity of one of the subordinate groups in relation to another subordinate group. And so that's us and blacks. Our relationships with blacks as the model minority versus them as the deficient. And then the second concept is civic ostracism. And this is when the dominant group, again, the whites, construct a subordinate group, us as Asian Americans, as perpetual foreigners incapable of assimilating with whites on racial and cultural grounds in order to ostracize that group. To take that even further, this dominant group will take steps to fuel tensions between minority groups in order to further the dominant group's own interests. So by comparing Asian Americans with the experience of blacks and other third world minorities, it keeps the dominant group from taking responsibility of the oppressive and dehumanizing nature and impact that the white supremacy has had on people of color. The creator of this concept also argued that this position was especially dangerous for Asian Americans if there's a lack of understanding of this concept within the larger context of power and race relations. Of course, probably because it means we're going to be used by whiteness, which we have and we've constantly seen happen in history. All that being said, that those are just some basics. We live in a negrophobic society to this day, and the fundamental divide isn't between whites and non-whites, it's between blacks and non-blacks. White supremacy terms have been assigned, like person of color, minority, third world people, to assign minority equivalency. These terms obscure anti-blackness and divide us as non-whites by assigning almost the same experience, the same minority equivalency, when that isn't the reality. Racial order is structured by anti-blackness and white supremacy. And the whole idea of be white, but above all, don't be black. And it's the idea that as Asian Americans, you feel the elevating force of being non-black, but the downward force of being non-white. As harmful as Asian exclusion was, I would agree that those structures were not as deep or pervasive as the anti-black racism that has prevailed throughout history and what Black Americans face. So you guys have probably seen a ton of stuff on what you can do on Instagram and social media. I'm just going to reiterate it again. Hopefully I was able to, if you weren't supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, I was able to change that or be able to share some more information that you might not have been aware of. Obviously, I'm going to list some places where you can donate. Please protest, donate money, educate people, and do what you can during these times. Consume Black content, understand the current state of race in America and your own personal shortcomings. This was basically just a shout in the void. I'm aware. I feel like I needed to make this. I'm hoping that it isn't a shout to the void, and I'm hoping that this does change a few people's perspectives, because the comment sections that I've been reading have been very upsetting. And I just think that by educating people more and giving people a better understanding of race relations in America. Hopefully that'll do something. Anyways, I'm happy to have educated discourse, if that even happens anymore. I think this is something that's really important to talk about.